I'd hiked that stretch of forest dozens of times, always stopping where the last orange trail marker clung to a dying spruce. But that morning, the woods felt open in a way I couldn't explain, as if something beyond the path was quietly pulling at me. So I kept walking long after the official trail vanished behind me. The deeper I went, the softer everything became. Snow muted the ground. The wind drifted somewhere above the canopy. Even the river nearby moved like it was trying not to disturb anything. My GPS lost signal half an hour in, but instead of panicking, I felt this strange sense of welcome settle around me. The world had narrowed to just the trees, the river, and the silence waiting between them. By late afternoon, I found a flat patch beside the water. It looked untouched. No prints, no campsites, no reason anyone would ever come this far on foot. I told myself that was why it felt good. Isolation always felt like control, at least at first. I pitched the tent facing the river, hung my food in a tree, set the lantern by the entrance, and let the cold sharpen the quiet until even my breaths sounded too loud. Night came early, the kind of darkness that doesn't fall so much as it folds over you. I must have drifted off, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the river glide past just a few feet away. At some point after midnight, I woke without knowing why. The air inside the tent felt colder than before, as if someone had opened it and left. I pushed myself upright, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Then I heard it, a small, metallic click. The lantern. It wasn't on when I fell asleep, I was certain of that, but there it was now, glowing softly, sitting exactly where I'd left it, its switch flipped up on its own. The warm circle of light pushed against the tent walls, steady and deliberate, as if something had decided I shouldn't sleep anymore. For a long moment I didn't move. I just watched the lantern breathe its light into the darkness and waited for whatever had turned it on to do the next thing. I turned the lantern off the way anyone would, telling myself I must have brushed it in my sleep. The explanation didn't fit, but it was the kind of lie you cling to when you're alone in the woods miles past where the world ends. The darkness returned thick and total, and I lay there listening to the river until exhaustion pulled me under again. But before dawn, something shifted in the air. A faint glow pressed through the wall of the tent, not sharp like a flashlight, but warm and steady, like a lantern burning just outside. I unzipped the flap and froze. The lantern was standing upright at the riverbank, perfectly balanced on the smooth stones. I hadn't moved it. No one should have been able to move it without making a sound. Its beam didn't point at me. It aimed across the water, straight into the tree line on the other side, as if marking something I wasn't supposed to see. The light barely reached that far, but every time the beam trembled on the current, the dark between the trees seemed to breathe. I stepped toward the river, expecting to find footprints, boot prints, drag marks, anything that could prove a person had walked through my camp. But the snow was untouched except for mine. No extra depressions, no scattered frost. Whoever or whatever placed that lantern there had left nothing behind, not even the hint of weight. The lantern held its aim, unwavering, like it was warning something in the trees that I was awake now. And as the first thin streaks of daylight crept over the water, I felt an unease I couldn't shake. Because whatever the lantern was pointing at didn't move, didn't answer, didn't step away. It just waited, hidden by the last shadows of night, until the sun washed everything blank again. Only then did the beam flicker and die, as if the lantern had done its job and no longer needed to speak for the dark. By morning, I was packed and ready to go long before the sun cleared the ridge. The woods looked normal again in daylight, but the normalcy felt staged, like a room someone had wiped clean too quickly. I walked back toward the way I came, expecting to see the familiar split in the trees, the soft rise of the marked trail. Instead, I found fresh mud swallowing everything. The path that should have led out was buried under a smooth, dark sheet of earth, as if the forest had pulled a blanket over it during the night. No footprints, no markers, not even the faint memory of a trail. Just mud, glistening like it had never been stepped on by a human being. I tried skirting around the mess, pushing deeper through the brush, hoping to reconnect with the trail farther on. But every route bent the wrong way, funneling me toward sections of woods I didn't recognize. Even the river looked off. Yesterday, it had run wide and slow, drifting south. Now, it pulled in the opposite direction, narrow and restless, dragging leaves upstream like the forest had flipped the current in its sleep. I checked my compass, then my map, then the small GPS clipped to my pack. The GPS blinked between signals, struggling to decide where it was, like the woods were interfering with more than just light. I told myself I had two choices, panic or wait. So I returned to the clearing and set my pack down again, pretending it was a plan I'd meant to make. One more night, I told myself. Just one more night. And daylight would straighten everything out. Trails didn't vanish. Rivers didn't change direction. Lanterns didn't move on their own. There had to be an explanation. But as the sun began its slow fall behind the trees, the river's edge shimmered with the same uneasy stillness I'd woken to the night before, as though the woods were waiting for darkness to show me what they had really done. Night settled in fast, as if the sun had dropped through the trees instead of sinking behind them. I lit the lantern before the shadows swallowed everything, but it didn't stay still for long. The flame inside shivered once, then flared bright on its own, casting a sharp, unnatural glow over the clearing. A moment later, the light began to pulse. Slow at first, like a breath. I stood watching it without meaning to, and before I understood what was happening, the rhythm had synced perfectly with my own breathing. Inhale, the glow strengthened. Exhale, it dimmed. Then it overtook me entirely, pulsing faster than I could match, as though it wanted my body to follow along. Every tree caught in the lantern's widening glow seemed to warp under the light. Their trunks leaned toward the river, branches lifted slightly, pulled by something just out of sight. Even the shadows bent wrong, curving toward the water in thin, stretched lines. The river itself looked darker than before, like the current had thickened into something heavier than water. I tried stepping back from the lantern, but the pulsing light made distance feel strange, swallowing depth and flattening the clearing around me. Then, across the river, something stood tall among the trees. It didn't move, it didn't shift. It didn't even seem to belong to the forest, just a vertical shape that refused to blur with the background. The lantern's glow touched the edge of it, and whatever it was absorbed the light without reflecting any back. I stared hard at it, trying to convince myself it was just another tree. But no tree had a silhouette that straight, that clean, that deliberate, and as the lantern pulsed again, harder this time, the shape didn't flinch. It only watched, waiting for something I couldn't hear yet. I kept staring at the shape across the river, forcing myself to believe it was only a tree trunk standing at a strange angle. The lantern's pulsing glow made depth hard to judge, turning the entire forest into shifting silhouettes. But that one shape stayed clean against the dark, too exact, too tall. The surface of the river rippled once, carrying a thin ribbon of reflected light across the water, and for a heartbeat it framed the figure more clearly. What I saw didn't blur or taper like bark. It ran straight from top to bottom without a break, a single unbroken line against the trees behind it. The wind pushed across the river, bending the smaller pines into slow, dragging sways. Branches dipped and lifted, needles hissing softly. but the figure didn't move at all. Not with the wind, not with the pulsing light, not with the shifting shadows that rolled over everything else. It stood as if the forest were moving around it, not with it, like it wasn't part of the valley at all. I felt the hair on my arms rise, the cold settling deeper into my chest than the air could reach. I looked away for only a second, just long enough to steady my breath. And when my gaze returned, the figure no longer stood where it had been. It was closer to the river now, still perfectly still, still impossibly tall, still holding its shape like it had never been part of the world that moved. A single step or an entire glide. I hadn't seen it happen, but it had happened. And the lantern's next pulse stretched the shadows all the way to my feet. The lantern fell without anything touching it. One moment it stood upright beside my pack, its glow pulsing against the rocks. The next, it tipped on its side as if nudged by an unseen hand, the beam sliding across the riverbank in a sharp, deliberate line. It didn't scatter light the way a dropped lantern should. It carved a path, clean, unwavering, tracking along the stones as though trying to draw my attention somewhere specific. I followed the beam with my eyes, waiting for it to stutter or fade. But instead, the pulse quickened, sinking with something deeper in the air, like the rhythm wasn't coming from the lantern at all. The river shimmered with the reflection, the water caught in that same uneven throb. For the first time, it didn't feel like the light was glitching or reacting to the cold. It felt purposeful, almost intelligent. The idea hit me with a weight I didn't want to acknowledge. The lantern had never been malfunctioning. It had been responding, maybe trying to warn me, or keep me from stepping closer to the river's edge. A faint crack sounded behind me. Then another. Not twigs snapping under footsteps, but branches dropping one by one from the canopy above, landing in a wide circle around my camp. Each hit thudded softly into the earth, evenly spaced, widening with every new fall until it felt like the forest was drawing a boundary around me, closing me in or marking me out. The lantern's beam jerked once, like a recoil. Something was coming. I ran before I fully realized I had made the decision. The forest seemed to shift beneath my feet, trails bending, roots twisting, like the woods themselves were rearranging to trap me. Every step felt familiar and wrong at the same time, a hall of echoes leading nowhere. The lantern's pulse behind me grew violent, hammering against the darkness, casting jagged shadows across the bent trunks and murky water. It wasn't guiding me out, it was pointing somewhere, toward the figure across the river, toward something I wasn't ready to confront. I stumbled to the edge of the bank and froze. The shape that had stood still all night moved for the first time, not forward, not across the water, but upward, elongating, stretching into the dark like it had always belonged to the shadow above, not the world beneath. The pulsing light struck it head-on, outlining every impossible angle, and I understood then that it hadn't been waiting for me to leave or to see it. It had been waiting longer than I could imagine, waiting for the moment when the lantern would finally stop pulsing, when the boundaries between the forest and the river, the seen and unseen, finally aligned. And then the lantern died. The pulse ceased. The river's reflection vanished. Only the night remained. In that darkness, I knew the answer had been there all along, etched in the still figure, the shifting woods, and the river that had changed its course. Something had been watching, waiting, orchestrating every shadow, every sound, every step. And finally, at the edge of comprehension, I understood why it had taken so long. But understanding didn't mean safety, not here, not ever. The forest swallowed the trail behind me, and I realized some paths were never meant to be walked, only found. The ridge had seemed harmless when the couple first arrived near sunset, a place brushed with warmth and the drifting comfort of distant campfire glow, where hikers lounged on boulders with steaming mugs, and the soft chatter of their stories blended with the evening breeze rolling over the pines. The western sky still held a pale orange smear, and for a while everything felt exactly the way a mountain overlook should: open, calm, scented with wood smoke and dust, the kind of place where time slows just enough for the world to feel safe. They walked the path along the edge, listening to the gentle rattle of metal cookware from a nearby group, the low hum of music bleeding from a small speaker, laughter blending with the wind, as if nature itself carried the sound to soften the solitude of the high ridge. Nothing tugged at their instincts, nothing whispered of danger. Even the shadows cast by the sinking sun stretched long and unthreatening across the crushed gravel clearing. Yet beneath that easy facade, something subtle shifted, though neither of them recognized it for what it was. Only the faint sense that several campers were packing earlier than necessary, tightening straps, rolling tents, extinguishing fires while the sky was still bright enough to warrant staying. The couple noticed it only in passing, exchanging curious glances as one pair of hikers folded their chairs in near silence, their movements oddly rushed. Another group gathering their lanterns like people who suddenly remembered an appointment waiting somewhere far below. No words were spoken about why they were leaving. The ridge still looked inviting. Nothing more than a panoramic ledge overlooking a sea of treetops trembling under the wind. And yet the mood that settled over those departing faces felt strangely hushed, like people avoiding eye contact so they wouldn't have to explain the unease pushing them away. As daylight thinned, something in the air began to change, though not in any dramatic way. No sudden chill, no ominous clouds, no distant roar. It was quieter, that was all. Quieter than it should have been for a place where dozens of hikers had gathered hours before. The laughter faded. The metal clinks stopped. Even the stray bursts of music had tapered into silence. The couple lingered near their tent, watching as the final streaks of orange surrendered to a violet haze, the ridge's vibrant ambience dissolving into a stillness that felt too complete, as though the mountain were pulling a heavy blanket over every sound. The breeze continued, steady but softer, moving over the land with a measured slowness that brushed the tops of the pines in long sighs. They tried to tell themselves it was normal. Wind rising and falling, night settling naturally. But the silence beneath it was not natural, the kind of silence that absorbs rather than shares. Even the pine needles seemed muted, their usual rustling falling into shallow whispers, barely touching the air. The couple built a small fire out of habit, feeding it dry twigs until the flames grew tall enough to cast a warm circle of light around their campsite. But as the fire crackled, the sense of having eyes on them, not watching exactly, but present, began to form like a faint pressure at the base of the skull, easy to dismiss in daylight, harder to ignore when the world narrowed to flickering shadows and the quiet pulse of embers shifting. They tried to imitate the hikers who had seemed carefree earlier, laughing softly, sipping from tin cups, but the firelight didn't carry the same warmth it had before. It flickered with a strange restraint, small and precise, as if aware of something in the surrounding darkness. At one point, the couple realized that they could no longer hear any neighboring campsites, not the murmur of conversations, not the shuffle of boots, not the crackle of someone else's fire breaking the monotony. It was as if they alone had stayed behind on the ridge. A heavy dusk blue curtain had fallen over everything, smothering the sounds that should have still existed. They turned toward the direction where a cluster of hikers had set up earlier, but all that remained were faint outlines of extinguished fire pits and prints in the gravel, already softened by the wind. They hadn't noticed the others leave. No footsteps, no polite goodbyes, not even muffled zipper sounds from tents being folded. Just absence, clean, swift, seamless. And with that absence came a fragile quiet that tightened around the ridge like something alive. As the fire dwindled, their voices naturally softened, though neither understood why they felt compelled to speak in near whispers. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a prickling sense of being too loud in a place that no longer wanted noise. The ridge's openness, once freeing, now felt exposed, as though standing under a vast, unseen ceiling. The couple watched the last bright hiker's headlamps disappear down the trail, each one swallowed by the tree line without a flicker of hesitation, not a single beam wavering or turning back. They wondered why everyone had left so soon. It was barely nightfall, the air mild enough to sleep comfortably. But when they tried to discuss it, their questions dissolved into uneasy laughter, the kind that fills space rather than gives answers. Beneath their feet, the gravel held a strange dampness, as if dew had settled too early, coating each pebble with a cold sheen that felt misplaced in the warm air. The couple pressed their palms to the ground near their tent and felt the temperature shift. Chill on the gravel, warmth in the air. A contradiction too small to mention aloud but too pointed to ignore. Over time, the silence deepened into something thicker, settling on the ridge with intention. No insects chirped. No owls called from the treetops. Not even the distant rush of wind through the valley rose enough to cut through the quiet. It was the silence of a house, holding its breath before a door opens. A silence that implied waiting. The couple crawled into their tent, leaving the last of the fire to burn out on its own, their bodies cocooned in the thin nylon walls that now felt fragile against the expanding darkness. Through the mesh window, they watched the ridge dissolve into silhouettes, the trees merging into a single black shape against the faint glow of the moon rising behind scattered clouds. They lay listening for anything. Footsteps, laughter returning, a stray dog barking far off, but nothing came. Only the soft, continuous exhale of wind brushing the tent's fabric. Even that sound began to feel unnatural, too steady, too rhythmic, like breath timed deliberately to their own. Minutes blended into an uncertain stretch of time, and the couple found themselves drifting into that half-aware state between wakefulness and sleep. But just as fatigue began to settle, the atmosphere shifted again. A subtle pull in the air. A change in pressure. A feeling they couldn't name but recognized instantly as wrong. The ridge had gone still, so still that their own breathing felt intrusive. Too loud, too human. The wind died without warning, leaving the tent suspended in a vacuum-like stillness, the nylon no longer rattling, not even bending inward from the air. They listened harder, holding their breaths, expecting something, anything, to fill the silence. But nothing did. And it was then that they realized the stillness wasn't neutral. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, it was directed, focused, the way a room feels when someone enters quietly and stands in the corner without speaking. A faint pressure crept through the clearing, brushing against the tent walls like the weight of attention. The couple didn't move, didn't speak, barely blinked. The darkness outside didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, not with footsteps, not with movement, but with awareness. A presence stretched thin across the ridge, settling in the spaces where laughter had once echoed, filling the gaps left by those who packed early, pressing against the edges of their campsite with a quiet, patient interest. The couple lay perfectly still as a cold ripple passed through the ground beneath them, subtle enough to discount but distinct enough to remember. And when they finally closed their eyes, trying to will themselves to sleep despite the thick unease clinging to the ridge, they didn't realize that nothing natural had caused the silence. Nothing natural had prompted the early departures, and nothing natural had settled over the ridge as night fully claimed it. They only knew that when the last ember of their fire died, the darkness outside seemed to lean closer, as if testing how deeply it could move without being noticed. They drifted off eventually, but not into rest, into a shallow, uneasy drift, the kind where every sound, every movement, every shift of fabric dragged them halfway back to consciousness. And sometime in the fragile hours before dawn, just when sleep threatened to take them fully, the stillness outside their tent thickened again, settling as if something had returned to the ridge, something that didn't breathe, didn't step, didn't rustle, only watched. At first light, the couple stepped out of their tent expecting the ridge to feel slightly warmer, slightly softer, the way dawn usually eased the harshness of mountain nights, but instead they found a fog so dense it hung inches above the ground like a living layer of cotton, muting color, flattening sound, and swallowing the familiar shapes of the campsite until everything looked strangely rearranged. Their breath rose in thin trails as they blinked through the white haze, trying to make sense of the blurred silhouettes of trees and the way the gravel glistened as though lightly frosted. Then they saw it, lying neatly placed just a few feet from their tent, perfectly centered in the small clearing as if someone had measured the distance. A brand new red sleeping bag, the fabric spotless, the material unmarred, the zipper pulled all the way to the top. It was so boldly colored, so unnaturally vibrant against the washed-out fog, that it looked almost staged, like a marker left intentionally for them to find. They exchanged a glance, neither wanting to approach it first, neither comfortable with how deliberate its placement seemed. Several nearby hikers, blurred outlines moving cautiously through the fog, drifted closer, curiosity drawing them in small, hesitant steps. Everyone insisted they hadn't seen it the night before. No one remembered any hiker carrying it, unpacking it, or placing it by mistake. It was as if it had materialized during the night without sound or movement, dropped quietly into existence only a few steps from where they slept. Someone whispered that something walked the ridge after midnight, dragging its feet in the gravel, though the fog swallowed the voice almost instantly. The couple tried to dismiss it. Fog distorts sound. People imagine things. Nerves run thin on a quiet mountain ridge. But the gravel outside their tent told a different story. Thin grooves cut through the damp stones led straight toward the red bundle, shallow but long, as though something heavy had been pulled or had dragged itself toward this exact spot before dawn. The couple crouched to examine the ground, noticing the way the fog seemed to recoil slightly around the sleeping bag, thinning just enough to reveal its pristine shape more clearly than anything else in the clearing. The air carried a metallic smell, cold, faintly sharp, like wet iron, and the longer they stared at the sleeping bag, the more they felt the same quiet wrongness that had settled over the ridge the night before. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to claim it. Yet no one could step away either. The fog muffled everything except the low, steady beat of their own pulse, and, in the stillness of that early morning, the red shape lay perfectly still, zipper sealed, fabric unbroken, as though waiting for someone to open it and confirm the terrible possibility that something had crawled inside when the world was dark and silent, and no one was listening. By late morning, the fog had thinned enough for the campsite to reappear in patches, fire pits, backpacks, taut lines of tents, but the red sleeping bag still sat untouched in the center of the clearing, so clean and bright it seemed wrong against the muted palette of damp earth and weathered gear. Curiosity, mixed with a kind of resigned dread, finally pushed the couple toward it, joined by a handful of uneasy onlookers who kept their arms folded tight as though bracing for something unpleasant. The zipper was stiff with cold when they gripped it, reluctant to move at first, and for a moment no one breathed as they tugged it downward inch by inch, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet air. When the sleeping bag finally peeled open, a collective hush spread through the group. Inside, the lining was shredded. Long, deep claw marks raked through the insulation, each one perfectly parallel to the next, too wide to belong to a bear, too straight for a mountain cat, too deliberate for anything that had simply thrashed in panic. The fabric had been carved, not torn, with a precision that felt unnatural for any wild animal. The insulation inside was darkened, not with blood, but with something like moisture, as though the interior had been dragged through wet earth. The couple stared at the marks, counted them, traced their angles with their eyes, trying to place them in any category their minds could accept, but nothing matched. A few people muttered theories. A prank, a staged scare, someone trying to start rumors. But no one stepped closer to inspect the claw marks directly, and no one wanted to touch the bag again now that it lay open like an emptied shell. The metallic smell from earlier lingered faintly, drifting from the torn lining as though whatever had been inside carried it with them. As the day progressed, the mood of the ridge began to shift. Hikers who were cheerful the previous night grew restless, talking in low voices, glancing repeatedly at the tree line as if expecting movement. The couple felt it too, that subtle prickling along the skin, the gut-deep sense of being studied from beyond the branches. Even the wind seemed subdued, threading through the pines with a slower, heavier rhythm. But what unsettled them most came later, when the sun dipped low and the clearing dimmed into gold and shadow. They turned back toward the sleeping bag, intending to show it to a few new arrivals, only to find the spot empty. The sleeping bag was simply gone. No drag marks, no footprints, no disturbed gravel, just a clean, bare patch of ground where it had been resting for hours. The group searched the surrounding brush, checked behind tents, even looked along the ridge trail, but there was nothing. Its disappearance was as silent as its arrival, and as the light faded, the couple felt the same quiet pressure return, the sense that whatever had been inside that claw-torn lining hadn't left the ridge at all. It was still here, somewhere in the trees, and it had taken its hiding place with it. As evening stretched across the ridge, the remaining hikers began murmuring to one another, their voices low and clipped, each sentence carrying a nervous edge that hadn't been there earlier. The couple noticed tents being packed up faster than usual, the zipper pull sharp against the muted sounds of wind and distant forest calls. Someone muttered about movement in the brush, a dragging sound heard in the middle of the night by hikers who had tried to sleep. Curiosity drove the couple toward the edge of the clearing, and that's when they noticed the thin, pale lines carved into the gravel, faint but deliberate, leading in sweeping arcs around the tents. The marks were too clean to be natural, too precise to have been made by falling branches or a careless hiker. They seemed intentional, mapped out as though guiding something, or recording its path. The couple crouched to examine them, noticing the subtle grooves pressed into the stone, each one following an arc that drew closer to their own tent. The air itself had shifted. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, as though the birds and insects that usually heralded dusk had vanished, held at bay by something unseen. Even the wind moved differently, rolling in shallow, hesitant pulses rather than its usual steady brush. Shadows lengthened against the ridgeline, stretching the tents into odd angles, and the couple's gaze kept flicking to the tree line, half expecting to see a figure emerge. Every now and then, the brush shivered without reason, a faint shift in the foliage that could have been animal or human, yet left no footprints, no further disturbance beyond the initial drag marks. As twilight deepened, hikers made quiet decisions to descend, moving quickly and whispering about the ridge being unsafe after nightfall, the sound of gravel crunching under boots echoing strangely in the thinning air. By the time darkness fully claimed the ridge, only a handful of tents remained, scattered like the final notes of a song fading into silence. And then the last lights winked out, one by one, leaving the couple in a half-shrouded clearing, the drag marks tracing unseen loops around their tent, faintly illuminated by the rising moon. In that muted glow, the empty spaces between trees seemed to pulse with expectation, and every shift of the air carried the subtle suggestion that something had been there, pacing, waiting, circling, never leaving. Even without sound, the tension coiled around their campsite like a living thing, aware of their presence, conscious of their fear, patient in its pacing. The couple lay in their tent, straining to hear, straining to see, feeling the drag of those invisible footsteps threading around them. The night pressed in closer, heavier than it should have been, and the ridge no longer felt like a safe overlook. It had become something else entirely, a quiet predator that kept the world at bay while it made them its audience, leaving the couple alone in the center of a clearing that had once seemed so ordinary, now twisted into a cage of shadow, gravel, and silence. They waited for hours, listening to nothing and feeling everything. They lay awake in the tent, the faint pulse of their own hearts loud against the thin nylon walls, staring into darkness that seemed to press closer with each breath. Outside, the ridge was still. Even the wind had paused, leaving the silence thick, heavy, and oddly deliberate. And then it began, a sound so soft at first they weren't sure they had imagined it. Gravel shifted somewhere near the edge of the clearing, slow, measured, deliberate steps. At first, it was far, circling the remaining tents in widening loops, a rhythmic scrape against stone that was too heavy to be a deer, too precise to be wind or falling branches. The couple held their breath, listening as the steps drew closer, tightening, as if something invisible was mapping the campsite, marking the positions of those who dared remain. Each time the rhythm returned to them, the sound of gravel shifting paused just inches from their tent, a faint pressure against the ground, almost perceptible through the floor. They could hear nothing else. No animal cries, no distant voices, only the slow, unhurried cadence of something moving, circling, waiting. It made no mistakes, no hesitation, as though it knew exactly where they were. Occasionally, it shifted pace, slowing to a crawl before picking up again, widening its loops, then narrowing directly around their small patch of clearing. The couple could feel the vibration through the nylon, subtle and irregular, like the shallow heartbeat of something just beyond touch, and it was impossible to tell if it was alive in the way humans understand life. They dared not speak, barely moved their fingers inside the sleeping bag, afraid that even the smallest sound would draw attention. Minutes, or hours, they couldn't tell, passed with the same patient rhythm, each circuit slower than the last, as if the thing was testing their endurance, measuring their fear, waiting for them to falter. Shadows outside shifted, thin and sharp, thrown by the occasional flare of moonlight, yet the source of the footsteps remained unseen, invisible in the fogged clearing. Every now and then, the movement paused near the edges of the tent, leaving silence so complete it felt intentional, calculated, pressing down into their chests. And then the scraping began again, precise, exact, methodical. Their own breaths echoed back unnaturally in the tent, caught in the mesh like some faint accompaniment to the circling steps. The couple lay frozen, wide-eyed, trapped, in the repetition, listening as the loops converged closer and closer. until the final pass traced a narrow path almost across the thin fabric where they lay, leaving only the faintest impression in the gravel, as if the earth itself had been weighed. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the steps receded, looping once more, stretching out toward the trees, leaving a quiet that hummed with attention. A silence that didn't feel empty, but alive. And the couple realized they had survived the first full hour of the night without seeing, hearing, or touching the thing circling them. But they also knew it had marked them, mapped them, and was waiting for dawn to break their fragile sense of safety. The footsteps had stopped entirely, leaving a silence so complete it seemed almost aware, pressing against the tent walls, thick and deliberate, as though whatever had been pacing the ridge had paused to consider them. The couple lay frozen, eyes wide, ears straining for any sound, but the clearing remained motionless, as if the world had held its breath for them. Then the first brush of fabric reached the tent, faint, hesitant, almost teasing in its touch, moving slowly across the nylon. It dragged, barely audible, a soft scraping that made the hairs on their necks rise, a sensation both tactile and invisible, leaving no impression on the gravel outside. Their hearts pounded, yet they could not move, could not look, caught in the realization that the red sleeping bag, the one that had appeared and disappeared without explanation, was back. Pressed firmly against the wall of their tent, it was heavier than it had any right to be, sagging slightly in the middle as if something inside strained against its confines. The shape moved, subtle at first, a gentle shift that suggested weight and intent, sliding along the fabric like it was testing the thin barrier between them. Each pause was calculated, deliberate, followed by another push, a stretch, a roll. It wasn't alive in any way they could name, and yet the motion suggested consciousness, thought, and attention solely focused on them. The couple's fingers gripped the tent floor, feeling the vibrations from each movement, a rhythm unlike footsteps or wind, a language of pressure that communicated patience, watchfulness, and something unspeakable. They dared to inch toward a flashlight, each breath caught in the cold night air. But before the beam could reach the red nylon, the shape within withdrew slightly, retracting itself like a creature hiding from discovery, dragging its own weight silently away. There were no footprints, no dragging marks, nothing left behind except the faint memory of touch through fabric. For a moment, the tent hung in eerie stillness, the kind of silence that burns behind the eyes, and the couple could only stare at the empty space where the bag had pressed, imagining what had moved inside it, aware that their guesses were insufficient, meaningless against the precision of the unknown. Every instinct told them that it had not gone far, that it was still there, just beyond the boundary of the nylon, patient, watching, waiting for them to falter again. The night stretched thin, every creak of the tent and sigh of wind magnified, each pause of their own breathing an invitation to the unseen presence outside. They could hear nothing, see nothing, and yet the ridge itself felt altered, reshaped around the bag's brief intrusion. When dawn still seemed far away, they realized the line between the bag and whatever had inhabited it had blurred, leaving only a residue of awareness, a creeping dread that something had learned their routine, their presence, their vulnerability. And though the movement had stopped, though the red fabric lay motionless once more against the tent wall, the couple could not convince themselves that it had left, that it had not already slipped into the ridge's shadows to return again, patient, deliberate, and unseen. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the ridge, the couple emerged from their tent expecting to see a few lingering hikers, the scattered tents, or at least the faint glow of smoldering embers, but the clearing was utterly abandoned. Every other tent had vanished, every campfire reduced to cold ash, and not a single boot print remained to indicate where anyone had gone. The red sleeping bag was gone, its sudden absence as deliberate and precise as its arrival had been. Gravel that had once held subtle drag marks now lay untouched, smooth as if the ridge had been wiped clean overnight. Their own tent seemed impossibly alone, perched at the center of a clearing that now felt strangely large, strangely empty, as though the world had contracted around it and pressed everything else into oblivion. They called out softly at first, their voices trembling, echoing faintly against the distant pines. Yet no reply came. Only the faint rustle of needles in the morning breeze, a sound that was familiar but hollow. Every instinct screamed that something had swept the ridge clean, that whatever had circled them through the night had removed everyone else, leaving them entirely isolated. The couple moved cautiously, stepping across the gravel and peering behind every tree and tent stake, finding nothing but absence, the forest still and watchful. As they began packing their tent, a new detail caught their attention. Fresh claw marks, sharp and defined, etched into the dirt directly behind their tent, 3 parallel lines stretching into the forest. Their eyes followed the lines, tracing them into the shadows, realizing they led nowhere familiar, vanishing between roots and rocks in a way that suggested a creature moving with unnatural ease, something not bound by ordinary movement or human limits. The air carried a faint metallic tang, the same smell that had lingered around the red sleeping bag, and the couple could feel it in their throats, on their skin, as if the ridge itself exhaled it deliberately. Even with the sun rising higher, the clearing felt wrong. Lighter, yes, but still heavy with attention, as though every tree and boulder had been rearranged to watch them leave. There were no footprints from the previous hikers, no signs of passage along the ridge trail, nothing to explain the sudden emptiness except the invisible presence they had sensed all night. Every rustle in the brush, every distant bird call that finally dared to return, sounded like it belonged to something else, something that had lingered while the world appeared normal to everyone else. The couple packed quickly, hearts racing, hands trembling, but even as they shouldered their backpacks and took cautious steps toward the trail, the claw marks behind them seemed to follow their gaze, insisting on remembrance. They dared not look back for long, yet the memory of the lines remained, etched into the ground like a signature, a warning, or a trail meant only for them. The ridge, once a place of escape and calm, had transformed into a corridor of attention, a landscape where the ordinary had been stripped away, leaving them entirely exposed. And in that exposure, in the empty clearing with the sun climbing slowly over the peaks, they understood that the night had not ended, that whatever had claimed the ridge had not left, and that the clawed lines stretching into the forest were not simply marks. They were an invitation, or a record, or a threat. Something had chosen them, and the ridge would not relinquish its claim so easily. I reached the campground just after noon, when the sun was bright enough to make the pines look almost friendly. It reminded me of the old fire lookouts I used to work near, quiet places where time drifted slower and the world felt manageable. I picked a site with a view of the abandoned ranger station, mostly out of nostalgia. From a distance, the cabin looked like something the forest had decided to keep instead of let go. Up close, it was worse. The roof sagged under decades of storms, and the walls were swallowed by layers of thick green moss. It clung to every corner, creeping over the windows like heavy curtains. Nothing moved around it, not a breath of wind, not a bird, just a silence dense enough to feel like weather. I walked the perimeter out of habit, checking the familiar points: fire ring, cleared pad, the old steps leading up to the cabin's porch. Those steps were the first thing that felt wrong. They were too clean. Every other surface was drowning in moss and rot, but the steps looked recently swept, almost polished, evenly centered, evenly spaced, facing perfectly toward my campsite. I told myself some hiker had brushed them off, a ranger doing a quick inspection. Anyone, really. But the ranger at check-in had made a point of saying this station had been shuttered for years, that nobody used it, nobody serviced it. Still, the steps were spotless, and the air around them felt expectant. The unease settled in slowly, the way a forest changes just before a storm. Nothing obvious, just a shift you can feel first in your ribs. Every time I looked back at the cabin, that sense tightened a little more. The moss on the walls looked thicker by the hour. The shadows under the porch stretched farther than they should have with the sun still high. By late afternoon, I kept catching myself glancing toward the station without meaning to, like something there was watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I tried focusing on normal tasks, pitching the tent, stacking firewood, boiling water, but my attention kept drifting back to those clean steps and the dark doorway above them. It wasn't fear, not yet, just the sense of being studied. When evening light slid behind the tree line, the station disappeared into silhouette. The moss looked darker, wetter, almost breathing with the shift in temperature. The shadows fused into a single black shape where the door would have been. I didn't like the way it faced my campsite, like a mouth left slightly open. I turned in early, not because I was tired, but because the light was gone, and with it went whatever thin comfort daylight offered. Inside my tent, the forest settled into its usual night sounds. Wind brushing needles, a distant owl, the crack of cooling branches, everything ordinary, and still, under all of it, I felt the cabin. Not moving, not making a sound, just waiting. I didn't know then that something new would be waiting in the morning. But the forest did, it always knows, before we do. Morning came with a thin gray light that barely made it through the treetops, and for a moment I felt foolish for how uneasy the station had made me the night before, until I stepped out of the tent and saw it. A white cooler sat on the top step of the abandoned cabin, perfectly centered, as if someone had measured the placement down to the inch. I knew it hadn't been there before. I'd looked at those steps too many times to mistake it. The cabin itself hadn't changed, still swallowed in moss, still sagging under forgotten years, yet the cooler looked impossibly clean, bright enough to stand out even in the muted morning light. I walked closer, slow and careful, scanning the ground for footprints, drag marks, tire tracks, anything that would explain how it got there. The dirt was undisturbed, the moss around the steps untouched. No insects crawled on the cooler, no condensation beaded on the plastic, no smell rose from it despite how the sun pressed heat against my skin. It was the kind of cooler you'd buy hours ago, carried straight from the store to a tailgate or picnic. Pristine, wrong. I circled it twice, feeling that same pressure of being observed, as though the tree line had eyes tucked between the branches. The air felt heavy, like the forest was leaning in, waiting for me to reach out and lift the lid. I didn't touch it. Every instinct from years of firefighting, years of walking into places where things went bad fast, told me not to. Yet the longer I stared at it, the more I sensed the cabin itself drawing me forward, the doorway behind the cooler carrying a depth that didn't match the building's size. By noon, I found myself checking it every few minutes, pretending it was idle curiosity when the truth was simpler. I didn't like turning my back on it. The cooler remained perfectly still, perfectly placed, as if pinned by invisible hands. Nothing about it belonged out here, not on an unused station, not in a forgotten clearing, not on steps that should have been rotting. By sundown, the unease sharpened. Every shift of wind felt deliberate. Every crack of twig had weight. Shadows from the tall pines stretched long across the ground, reaching the cooler first before sliding toward my campsite like dark fingers. The station seemed to watch from behind its moss curtain, patient and unblinking. I tried to cook dinner, but my attention snapped back to the steps every few seconds, convinced the lid had opened a fraction, convinced the cooler had moved. I kept telling myself I'd imagined it, the way isolation can play tricks when the woods go quiet. But the quiet itself felt intentional, like the forest wanted to see what choice I'd make. By the time the last light bled from the sky, one thought kept circling back, steady and relentless. Whatever was inside that cooler wasn't waiting to be found. It was waiting for me to open it. And the cabin wanted the same. I tried to clear my head with a short hike, just enough distance to remind myself that the world outside the station was still normal, still steady, still rooted in things that made sense. The trail was quiet but familiar. Pine needles soft underfoot, the smell of sap hanging in the warm air. Nothing followed me. Nothing watched me. Nothing moved in that wrong, breathless way the cabin seemed to. For a little while, I believed the cooler was just some odd prank or forgotten gear someone had left behind. But when I stepped back into my campsite, all of that collapsed. The cooler was no longer on the cabin steps. It sat in the center of my fire ring, perfectly balanced on the stones, as if placed with careful hands. No tracks surrounded it, no moss disturbed, no dents or scratches to show it had been dragged or lifted. Just there, waiting. Exactly where the flames would be if I'd lit a fire. The afternoon light seemed to dim around it, not from clouds, but from the kind of heaviness that changes the air itself. The woods had gone still, too still. No wind brushed the treetops, no birds chattered. Even the insects that had buzzed earlier were gone, leaving a silence so total it felt alive. I stood there longer than I meant to, fighting the rising suspicion that the forest had arranged itself around me, that the cooler hadn't been carried or placed so much as grown out of the ground, sprouting like some white fungus fed by the station's rot. Every attempt to ignore it only sharpened its presence. My gear seemed smaller beside it. My tent looked thinner. The fire ring felt older, as if the stones had crumbled further since morning. I kept telling myself someone must have moved it while I was gone, some hiker passing through playing a joke, but that explanation broke apart the longer I stared at the untouched earth. The daylight thinned into evening, shadows stretching themselves into long, warped shapes across the dirt. They crawled over the ring first, pooling beneath the cooler like spilled ink. I tried to keep busy, cooking, reorganizing gear, anything to shake off the unease, but the weight of that object pulled at the edges of my attention until I couldn't think about anything else. And that's when I heard it, the faintest, softest knocking. A single, gentle tap from inside the cooler, then another. Slow at first, spaced out like cautious breaths. The sound didn't match any animal I'd ever heard trapped in a container. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, it was patient, measuring me. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the knocking settled into a rhythm, steady and deliberate, echoing just enough to feel impossibly close. I stood frozen, feeling the forest gather around me in a tight, breathless ring. Whatever was in that cooler hadn't followed me from anywhere. I realized with a cold certainty it had always been here. And now it knew exactly where I was. Darkness settled fast, the way it does in deep woods when the sky decides it's done giving you light. By the time I finally lit my lantern, the cooler sat in the fire ring like a pale, waiting eye, barely visible through the rising shadows. The knocking had grown quieter for a while, almost timid, and then, just when I convinced myself it might have stopped altogether, it came again. A soft, deliberate tap from inside the plastic. A beat of silence, then another. The timing didn't feel random. It felt attentive, measured. I took a step back, and the knocking quickened by the smallest fraction. Just enough to tell me it wasn't a coincidence. Every time I shifted my weight or breathed a little louder, the sound adjusted, as if something inside was tracking my movement through the dark. The forest around me felt hollowed out, stripped of anything familiar. Even the wind refused to blow. My lantern flickered in a way fuel lamps weren't supposed to, like the flame wanted to shrink away from the fire ring. I kept telling myself to run, to abandon everything and get to my truck, but some stubborn instinct made me hold position. It didn't feel safe to turn my back on the cooler, not when the knocking seemed to notice every twitch of muscle. I tried speaking aloud once, just my own name, barely above a whisper, as if grounding myself might help. The cooler went silent instantly. The woods followed, sealing me in a dome of stillness so complete I could feel my heartbeat echo through it. For a long stretch there was nothing, not even the suggestion of movement from inside the cooler. Then the sound returned, different this time. A shift. Something slid across the inner surface of the lid, a single, slow scrape, like nails dragging lightly over plastic. The noise was subtle, but it carried in the quiet as sharply as a scream. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't confused, it was exploratory, as though the thing inside was feeling for a weakness, testing the boundary between its world and mine. I stepped back again, slower, careful not to make a sound, but the scrape followed my retreat with perfect timing. The trees seemed to inch closer, their narrow silhouettes merging into a tight ring around the campsite. Every instinct I had, every bit of training I'd ever relied on, told me to flee before whatever was inside that cooler found a way out. But something about the air felt locked, like an unseen hand had pressed pause on the world. I couldn't hear my own breath, couldn't feel the usual night chill. There was only the scrape, faint but intentional, sliding beneath the lid in small, curious arcs. When it finally stopped, the silence that replaced it felt heavier than the sound itself. I knew the knocking hadn't ended. It was waiting, and whatever came next would be worse. Midnight crept in without warning, the kind of hour that doesn't feel like time passing so much as time thinning, stretching itself too far until every second feels exposed. I sat in the dark with the lantern barely lit, trying to steady my breathing while the cooler rested in the fire ring like a white tombstone. The scraping began so softly I thought it was just the fabric of my tent shifting, but when I stepped outside, the sound grew sharper, frantic clawed strokes dragging across the inside walls of the cooler. At first, the rhythm was wild, panicked, like something trapped and desperate. But then it changed. The strokes slowed, tightened, fell into a repeated sequence that made no natural sense. 3 short scrapes, 1 long, 3 again. A pause, then 2 taps against the inner lid. It took me longer than it should have to recognize the pattern. I'd heard it before, chalk on a board, boots knocking under a table, Morse code during training. Except this wasn't code for words, it was spelling something out piece by piece. My name. A cold weight flooded my chest as the tapping repeated, deliberate and patient, each beat landing exactly where it needed to, forming the cadence I'd only ever heard from human hands. I stood frozen, watching the plastic vibrate with every tap, feeling the woods pull tighter around me. The cooler seemed to breathe with the forest, expanding slightly with the night air, shrinking back as the sounds inside grew more coordinated, more aware. I backed toward the tent, keeping the cooler in sight, not trusting the dark around it. and then the tapping stopped. For a second, the silence felt merciful, until something new rose through it. A whisper. It came from inside the cooler, thin and dry, like air escaping through a crack in old wood. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was the wind threading between branches. But the sound sharpened, shaping itself into syllables, the first ones muddled, the next clearer, the next unmistakable. My name again, spoken in a voice that didn't sound young or old or anything alive. It sounded rehearsed, borrowed, as though it had learned the shape of the words from listening too closely to me. I stumbled into the tent, pulling the zipper closed with shaking hands, though fabric meant nothing against whatever waited outside. The whispering didn't fade with distance. It grew clearer, hovering inches from the tent wall, tracing the perimeter as if sliding a mouth along the nylon. My breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale quickening with the whispers. They formed my name again and again, sometimes stretched into long, broken vowels, sometimes clipped short like an echo bouncing off concrete. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice seeped through, calm and steady, knowing exactly how close it was to breaking me. When it finally fell silent, the tent felt smaller than ever, the forest impossibly wide and hollow. I knew the cooler hadn't stopped calling. It was only waiting for me to answer. First, light seeped into the tent like a mercy I hadn't earned, a pale, washed-out glow that felt too thin to protect me from what waited outside. I didn't bother packing anything. Every instinct I had screamed to leave the moment I sensed the whispers had gone quiet. The forest felt paused, as if whatever lived inside that cooler had fallen into a shallow sleep. I slipped out of the tent, boots half-laced, jacket hanging open, and didn't dare look toward the fire ring. The air was colder than dawn should have been, so cold my breath came out in tight, sharp bursts that vanished too quickly. Twigs crackled under my feet as I moved, each sound too loud in the stillness. Not even the smallest breeze touched the branches overhead. It was the kind of quiet you only hear in the seconds before something wakes up. I forced myself onto the trail, walking fast at first, then pushing into a near jog when the silence behind me felt like a held breath. The woods were wrong in daylight, tinted gray, drained of birdsong, every trunk standing too straight, like the trees were posted soldiers lining my escape route. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the cooler dragging itself after me or watching from the clearing, but nothing was there. Nothing moved, nothing chased. That stillness was worse. It felt like permission. The trail stretched longer than it should have, each bend familiar but slightly off, as if I were walking through a copy of the forest instead of the real thing. The air shifted once, a faint tremor that felt like the moment before a door slams. Then came a sound behind me. A small, definite bump, just loud enough to freeze me mid-step. Not a branch falling, not a squirrel, a bump, solid, intentional. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what could keep pace without footsteps. My walk became a fast, stumbling power march until the trees thinned, and the outline of the parking lot finally appeared through the pines. Relief hit me hard enough to make my knees weak. My truck sat alone in the gravel, streaked with morning dew, the windows strangely fogged from the inside as though someone had been breathing heavily behind the glass. I slowed, instinctively reaching for the keys in my pocket, feeling the metal shake against my fingers. Something about the truck felt off. The angle of the side mirror, the faint tilt of the driver's door, the way the condensation on the windshield seemed to pulse with each step I took toward it. I told myself it was nothing. That fear could make anything look alive. But the closer I got, the more certain I became that I wasn't approaching an escape. I was approaching whatever the forest wanted me to find. My hand trembled as I pressed the key fob, unlocking the doors with a dull electronic chirp that sounded painfully out of place in the dead morning air. I reached for the handle, hesitating only once, before pulling the door open and staring into the fogged interior, heart already sinking at what I knew I was about to see. The door swung open with a soft groan, and the first thing that hit me was the cold, an unnatural chill rolling out of the cab like air from a long-sealed cellar. My windshield was fogged from the inside, thick and smeared, as though a hand had dragged through the condensation again and again during the night. I leaned in one cautious inch at a time, bracing myself for an animal, or a stranger, or nothing at all. But it wasn't any of those. It was the cooler. An identical white box sitting upright in the passenger seat, angled toward me like it had been waiting for eye contact. This one was cleaner than the last, if that was possible. Not a scratch, not a speck of dust, like it had been born in that seat, not placed there. The lid was cracked open just enough to show a sliver of blackness inside, a darkness that didn't reflect anything, didn't give anything back. As I stared at that gap, a faint pulse of air rose from it, a soft, steady drift of cold breath that brushed my face with a familiarity I didn't want to understand. My mind tried to assemble the logistics. No footprints in the lot, no broken glass, no time for anyone to follow me down the trail, let alone slip into my locked truck. But fear has a way of stripping the world of logic until only the impossible remains. I stepped back instinctively, my hand slipping off the door frame, gravel crunching under my heel. The cooler didn't move, but its presence filled the cab like a living thing. The shadows inside the truck were wrong. Too deep, layered like folds of fabric, shifting just enough that I couldn't tell whether the lid had opened a fraction more or if my eyes were adjusting to something they shouldn't see. I kept staring, breath shallow, telling myself that if I blinked, if I turned away, the cooler would be somewhere else when I looked back, closer, maybe, or open wider. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. The cold air drifting from the gap tasted metallic, the way tools smell after being left out in winter. I took another step back, then another, each movement slow, deliberate, careful not to trigger some response I couldn't anticipate. And as I moved, the lid shifted. Not much, just a soft, silent fraction, but enough to break whatever fragile distance I had left. Enough to show it wasn't waiting to be found. It was inviting me. The cab felt deeper than it should have, the darkness inside stretching backward like a tunnel, as though the interior of my truck had been hollowed out into something far larger than it was moments ago. The cooler sat at the mouth of that darkness, angled patiently toward me, the crack in its lid widening with each breath I took. I didn't wait to see what waited inside, but even as I backed away, heart pounding, legs unsteady, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever lived in that cooler wasn't finished with me. It was only letting me step away so I'd have room to run, and something in those shadows wanted me to. I reached the research zone just after noon, when the sun was still threading between the pines and the air felt harmless. The path in was easy, old tire ruts, a few broken markers, nothing unusual for a discontinued wildlife study. I remember thinking the place felt abandoned in a gentle way, the kind of quiet you get when humans stop visiting and the forest finally exhales. But the deeper I walked, the more that quiet shifted. It wasn't peaceful, it was empty. There were no insects buzzing around my pack, no birds shifting in the canopy. Even my footsteps landed too softly, as if the ground was swallowing them before the sound could carry. I told myself it was just seasonal change, colder nights, finicky wildlife. But some part of me knew the forest should never feel this still in the middle of the day. I found the first trail camera barely 100 yards in, sun-bleached, cracked, still strapped to an old cedar. Routine work. I logged the coordinates, checked the mount, confirmed the housing had weathered well enough to catalog. But when I stepped back to photograph it for the report, I noticed the angle. It wasn't facing the trail, or the clearing, or even the animal corridor marked on the outdated map. It was turned, subtly, but deliberately, toward the same distant slope rising just beyond the tree line. I shrugged it off. Animals bump them, storms twist them, brackets loosen over time. Still, I kept glancing at the slope, wondering what could have nudged a camera that far off its axis. Then I found the second one. This one was older, installed nearly a decade before the study ended. Different bracket, different species focus, and yet it faced the exact same direction. Not roughly, precisely. The same few degrees of tilt, the same frame of forest in its line of sight. A small current of cold slipped through the trees just then. A single gust, sharp enough to sting. It carried the scent of wet bark and something faintly metallic, like old tools left out in the rain. My arms rose with goosebumps before I could stop them. I pushed farther in, telling myself I was imagining the pattern. But the next camera matched the others, and the next, and the one after that, half buried under moss, its lens clouded but still aimed toward that same quiet slope. I stood there for a long moment, the forest pressed in around me, the silence thick enough to feel. The wind had died again, leaving the pines perfectly still, as if they were all waiting for something. Nothing moved. No birds, no snapping twigs, no distant rustle. But as I stared at that unmapped rise in the distance, I felt the faintest pulse of cold air brush the side of my neck, like an answer to a question I hadn't asked out loud. And for the first time, I wondered why none of the researchers had ever come back for these cameras, why they'd left them here, pointing toward something they'd chosen not to study. By the next morning, the forest felt heavier, as if the silence from yesterday had settled into the soil overnight, pushing down on everything that lived beneath the pines. I started early, moving deeper into the study area, logging coordinates one by one, with the practiced rhythm I'd used on dozens of field assignments before this. At first, everything looked routine: rotting posts, frayed straps, metal brackets pitted with rust. But each camera I found, regardless of age or model, shared the same impossible alignment. They all faced that same unmapped rise in the distance, the slope barely visible through the crowded trunks but unmistakably there, drawing every lens like a lodestone. I tried to be rational. Maybe the terrain shifted over the years. Maybe storms bent trees enough to rotate the mounts. But when I knelt to inspect a particularly old unit bolted into a stone outcropping, I saw faint crescent marks etched into the metal. Scrapes, fresh enough to expose bright silver beneath the oxidation. Something had rotated it manually, and recently. That realization sank into me like a cold drop of water sliding down the spine. On the next camera, the screws themselves had been strained, twisted just enough that the ridge of each head was freshly stripped, as if someone, or something, had forced them past their original position. The forest offered no explanation. My own breath felt louder than it should have, pressing against the quiet. Even the crunch of needles under my boots sounded wrong, muffled, as if the ground were absorbing every noise before it could echo. I checked my map again, tracing the dotted boundary lines of the discontinued study. The slope these cameras pointed toward wasn't labeled, wasn't referenced, wasn't even included on the contour grid. It was just empty white space, an omission that suddenly felt intentional. By midday, the air had cooled, the light thinning out beneath the canopy despite the clear sky above. I stepped between two leaning pines and reached another camera, this one newer, only a few years old. Its bracket had clear fingerprint smudges in the grime along the edges, but no human trails led to it. No footprints, no disturbed brush, nothing but undisturbed forest floor thick with needles. When I looked up toward the ridge, a flicker of shadow cut between the trees, quick enough that I questioned whether I'd actually seen anything at all. There was no movement after, no sound, just the sudden sense that the woods had taken a breath and was holding it. Then, without warning, the sun dropped behind the ridge, and the canyon-like stretch of pines around me fell into a premature dimness. The temperature dipped sharply, fast enough that my fingers stung as I adjusted the strap of my pack. The forest didn't just grow quiet, it shut down. No breeze, no rustle, nothing living. Every camera I had passed now sat behind me, all aimed toward the rise like watchers waiting for something to emerge. And as the shadows stretched across the forest floor, I felt the unmistakable pressure of being observed, not from the ridge, but from somewhere far closer. By midday the next day, I finally reached the base of the slope every camera had been staring at, though it didn't look like a place anything worth studying would hide. The hillside rose steeply between the pines, cluttered with old roots and thickets that looked untouched for decades, yet the ground at my feet told a different story. Patches of soil were disturbed in long, curling arcs, as though something had moved across the forest floor with a dragging gait. Too wide for deer tracks, too low and irregular for any person. Even the leaf litter around those impressions had been pressed into compact, unnatural shapes, as if whatever made them had shifted its weight in ways that didn't match jointed limbs. I followed the pattern for a few yards until it vanished abruptly beneath a tangle of brush, as if the creature had dissolved into the undergrowth without disturbing anything above it. The air thickened the farther I tried to climb, the trees leaning in at angles that didn't match the slope, their trunks narrowing and twisting toward each other like ribs forming a cage. Each time I raised my hand to push aside branches, I felt the faintest vibration running through them, not wind, not insects, something deeper, as if the wood itself carried a pulse. I checked the map again out of habit, but the hillside remained a blank void on paper, a space that shouldn't have existed. When I looked up from the map, the path I'd taken to reach the base felt subtly wrong. Pines I didn't remember passing seemed to have crept closer, as though the forest reshaped itself while my attention drifted. The climb became harder with each foot of elevation, not because of the incline, but because the trees formed tighter clusters, forcing me sideways, funneling me into narrow gaps that scraped my shoulders. A crawling sensation threaded through my spine, the kind of instinctive alarm that warned of something just outside vision. I paused, trying to listen for movement, but the silence was absolute. Even my breathing sounded like an intrusion. Then, somewhere behind me, a dull thud echoed through the trees, solid, resonant, as if something heavy had dropped onto soft earth. I spun around, scanning the shadows between the pines, but nothing shifted. No branches swayed, no soil moved. The air didn't even tremble from the impact. It was as if the sound had come from the forest itself rather than within it. I waited, every muscle coiled, expecting another noise, another sign, but nothing followed. The forest held its stillness like a clenched jaw. The slope above me seemed steeper now, the trees crowding closer, their branches overlapping to blot out the pale afternoon light. Instinct told me to stop climbing, to back away before the woods swallowed whatever distance remained between me and the unseen thing that left those impressions. Yet, as I turned to retreat, the same cold, Pressure I'd felt the day before tightened around my ribs. A presence, patient and steady, watching from somewhere just out of sight, waiting for me to take one more step into the blank space the map refused to name. I set up camp earlier than usual, hoping the extra daylight would steady the unease that had been tightening around me since the slope, but the forest only seemed to grow heavier as I worked. My tent felt small beneath the leaning pines, the lantern's glow barely pushing back the dimness pooling under the branches. I spread out my catalog sheets, pinning the corners with sample jars to keep them from fluttering in the faint breeze that drifted through camp. Though even that breeze felt unnatural, too cold and too directed, like it came from a narrow opening somewhere deep in the woods. As the sky darkened, the usual transition into nighttime sounds never arrived. No shifting wings overhead, no rustle of small animals settling in, not even the soft creak of trees adjusting with the cooling air. Midnight announced itself only by the clock on my watch, and even that felt strange. The moment the digits clicked over, the air stilled completely, as if the forest were holding its breath. I sat up, alert without knowing why. The silence was absolute, thick enough that I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then, from somewhere just beyond the tent, a soft tick echoed, quick, mechanical, like the hesitant shutter of a camera waking from long disuse. Another tick followed, then another, slowly circling the perimeter of the camp. I told myself it must be branches cooling, settling, cracking in the cold, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too metallic, each sound spaced as if timed. My breathing grew shallow, my ears straining for any hint of movement. That was when my watch flickered. At first, I thought it was the lantern reflecting off the display, but the digits themselves shifted. 12:03, then 12:18, then 12:04, jumping forward and backward in fast, disjointed stutters. The second hand twitched wildly, skipping entire minutes before freezing again. A low tremor ran through the tent poles, not from wind, but from something heavier brushing past them. I held still, hardly daring to breathe. The ticks grew closer, circling tighter, moving with the slow patience of something that knew exactly where I was. My lantern dimmed for a heartbeat, then steadied, its glow trembling inside its casing. Shadows outside the tent thickened into elongated shapes, unmoving but present, as if they were waiting for the light to fail entirely. I tried to listen for footsteps, breathing, anything human, but the only sound was that unnatural, methodical ticking. Camera shutters adjusting, lining up, synchronizing with a purpose I didn't want to imagine. When the noise finally stopped, the silence that followed felt even worse, as if the forest had paused to listen for my reaction. I checked my watch again, hoping for normalcy, but the digits continued to flicker between impossible times. Midnight stretched on longer than it should have, the minutes refusing to settle, and as I lay there staring at the trembling lantern light, I had the unnerving sense that the forest hadn't lost its breath at all. It was holding mine. Dawn crept in weakly, a washed-out gray that barely filtered through the pines, and for a moment I let myself hope the strange stillness of the night had been nothing more than exhaustion, twisting my senses. But the moment I stepped out of the tent, that hope fell away. Every camera I'd logged the day before, those scattered across half a mile of dense forest, now pointed downward. Not toward the slope anymore, but at the forest floor itself, as if tracking something that had moved through camp while I slept. Their angles were too sharp, their orientations too uniform. Each lens tilted almost identically, staring into the leaf litter like they'd all seen something crawl past in the dark. I walked the perimeter slowly, feeling watched from every direction even though nothing stirred. The leaves around the tent were flattened in uneven, looping patterns. Not quite footprints, not quite drag marks, but patches of compressed earth that suggested weight distributed low to the ground, something that slid rather than stepped. I crouched beside one of the patterns, brushing aside a scatter of needles to find the earth damp beneath, disturbed hours earlier. No claw prints, no hoof prints, just pressure, like a body pressing against the soil with long, shifting movements. When I straightened, a flicker of red caught my eye. One of the cameras, an older model with a dead internal battery, blinked at me. Just a single blink. A tiny red LED pulsing from hardware that shouldn't have had power, shouldn't have had anything left to signal with at all. I stepped closer, telling myself it had caught a reflection, a trick of sun against cracked plastic. But the light pulsed again, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging my approach. There was no hum of circuitry, no warmth from the housing, nothing to suggest it was operational. Yet the lens tracked me, tilting by a hair, almost imperceptibly, the adjustment so subtle I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been staring directly at it. Every instinct told me to back away, but my body stayed frozen. My breath caught somewhere high in my chest. The air around me felt colder, the kind of cold that doesn't belong to morning, but to late-night corridors and shut-in spaces where light can't reach. I turned away finally, forcing myself toward the next camera, only to find the same unnerving tilt, the same downward focus, as if all of them had witnessed something that had slithered between the trees while I lay blind inside my tent. Each unit, old or new, working or dead, now aimed at the same quiet place beneath the pines, the space I was standing in. And as the breeze finally stirred, rustling the needles in a long, shaky whisper, it felt less like wind and more like a warning breathed directly against the back of my neck. By late afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the cameras had tracked during the night had moved far closer than I'd realized. So I gathered the SD cards and retreated into the tent, zipping the flap shut as if a layer of nylon could protect me from anything out here. The lantern cast a dim, amber glow over the tarp floor, enough to see my hands trembling slightly as I slotted the first card into the reader. The footage was uneventful. Hours of swaying branches and shifting light. The next card showed the same empty woods, frame after frame, of nothing but stillness. I told myself the cameras hadn't captured anything because nothing had happened. Not because something clever enough knew how to avoid them. But the deeper I went, the more wrong the footage felt. The forest in the videos wasn't the forest I'd walked through. The shadows looked thicker, the branches more tangled, as though the trees themselves had shifted during the night. When I reached the final card, the lantern flickered, and for a second I considered turning it off altogether, some instinct whispering that I shouldn't watch this in full light. Still, I pressed play. The footage began like the others. Empty woods, no movement. I advanced, frame by frame, expecting nothing, and then I saw it. A shape at the far edge of the frame, so pale it almost blended into the washed-out bark behind it. At first, I thought it was a piece of sunlit fungus, some pale root exposed by erosion. But then the shape curved, jointed, unmistakably the angle of a wrist. A hand, thin and colorless, slipped from behind a trunk, the fingers impossibly long, each one tapering to a soft, unnatural point. It reached outward slowly, creeping toward the lens with a hesitant, almost curious motion. My mouth went dry. The hand wasn't shaped right. It was too narrow, too elongated, the proportions all wrong. And the movement, it wasn't the reaching of a person. It reminded me of the slow stretch of something that had never needed to move quickly before. I leaned in without meaning to, the lantern's warmth brushing the side of my face. The hand extended across the frame, closer, closer still, until two of the fingers pressed lightly against the housing of the camera, just enough to shift the angle by a fraction. The frame jolted slightly, and then the hand angled upward, pausing as if it sensed something beyond the lens, as if it sensed me. It didn't pull back, it didn't vanish. It simply turned slowly, those long fingers adjusting in a way that felt not inquisitive but aware, like the camera wasn't the thing it meant to find. The footage cut abruptly there, leaving the last frame frozen on that upward gesture, the hand poised mid-search. I stared at the screen long after it went black, the tent suddenly too small, the forest too quiet, the air too still, because whatever had reached for that lens had not been reaching for the camera at all. It had been reaching for the person who would watch the footage. By dusk, I had already packed half my gear, desperate to get out before the woods swallowed the last of the light. But something slowed me. Some primal instinct that leaving in a panic would only draw more attention. So I forced myself to move methodically, folding, fastening, checking pockets I didn't need to check. The forest around me felt tighter than it had that morning, as if the trees had leaned closer during the day, sealing the trails behind me. I told myself that once I stepped out of the tent, I'd make it back to the main path before dark fully settled. But the moment I unzipped the flap and stepped into the open air, that plan dissolved. The forest floor was different, too orderly, too deliberate. Every single trail camera, dozens of them, some I knew were half-mile away, had been removed from their mounts and placed around my campsite in a perfect circle. Not scattered, not dropped, arranged. Each one stood upright in the dirt like a small, silent sentinel, lenses all facing inward, toward me. Their red indicator lights blinked in a synchronized rhythm, slow and steady, beating like a mechanical pulse. The sight froze me completely. Cameras that had been bolted into rock, strapped to trees too thick for me to wrap my arms around, and mounted in places no person could reach easily, all of them here, perfectly spaced, forming a ring so precise it looked measured. And the forest was too quiet again, that same suffocating stillness from the night before, but deeper now, as if even the air didn't want to move. I forced myself to step forward, just enough to see the far edge of the circle. The dirt beyond was undisturbed, no footprints, no drag lines, no sign of how the cameras had been carried or lowered or arranged. The ground looked untouched. But something had done it. Something that didn't leave signs I could follow. A faint rustle drifted from the trees then, soft, almost apologetic, like a hand brushing lightly against a sleeve. I turned, scanning the darkening brush, expecting to catch a glimpse of an animal, but the sound didn't repeat. Instead, it shifted location, sliding around the perimeter just beyond the cameras, moving in an arc too smooth to be footsteps. I felt it before I heard it again. A subtle pressure, a sense of displacement, as though something passed close enough to bend the air, but not the branches. Then the rustle came again, nearer this time, just behind the arc of blinking red lights. I held my breath, listening. The lights seemed to pulse faster, reacting, or maybe syncing with whatever circled just beyond them. Another sound followed, not a footstep, not a breath, but a faint dragging, like fabric or skin, brushing lightly against the forest floor. It paced the full curve of the circle, lingering at points as if choosing where to breach. My entire body, tightened, muscles locked, breath held in my throat. Because whatever had been reaching for the lenses in the footage, whatever crawled low across the ground, whatever rotated the cameras in the night, it was now standing just outside the ring it had built around me, waiting. I stumbled back a step, heart hammering, trying to create distance from the blinking circle that had taken the place of my campsite. and that was when the first camera moved. Slowly. Imperceptibly at first, like it was testing its own joints, then deliberately, a mechanical tilt downward that carried its lens across the forest floor towards something behind me. My stomach dropped, and I spun around, but the brush was empty, the slope beyond the pines still dark and silent. Then the second camera followed the first, its red light sweeping along a calculated arc, as if tracking something I had not yet seen. One by one, the rest joined, each lens pivoting with eerie precision, a synchronized choreography that seemed to anticipate my every step. I froze, unable to move, feeling the pressure of hundreds of unseen eyes converging on a single point. Me. A dragging sound began behind the cameras, low and deliberate, moving along the ground with the slow, steady rhythm of something that didn't run but knew exactly how to approach. Leaves shifted without wind. The needles beneath the pines compressed in rolling patches, moving toward the circle, toward the cameras, toward me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were trapped under lead, the gravity of the forest pressing down heavier with every heartbeat. I tried to scan the ridge, the slope that had first drawn all these cameras, but the darkness there was complete, a void that didn't answer to light or sound. Then I realized the circle wasn't just facing inward, it was waiting. Each red blink seemed timed, a warning, a signal, and the lenses were not just observing, they were calling me out, forcing me to acknowledge whatever had orchestrated this. My chest tightened as the dragging sound came closer, too close to ignore, scraping through the undergrowth with a rhythm that matched the mechanical pulse of the blinking LEDs. I could sense it circling the perimeter, sliding around, aligning itself with the angles the cameras had already marked. The forest had become a trap, an unseen geometry of observation and motion, and I stood at the very center, exposed. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a thin shadow stretch across the outer edge of the circle, limbs, or something like limbs, sliding over the ground with impossible patience. And then I understood. All at once, the cameras fixed directly on me. Every lens, every red blink, every silent mechanical rotation locked in synchronized aim, focusing as though each unit were part of a hive mind designed to mark my position, to declare I had been found. My instincts screamed to flee, to leave this cursed ring behind, but my feet refused to obey. The dragging continued, closing the last gap, and I felt the air shift around me, heavier, more deliberate, carrying a pressure that made my hair stand on end. And then the forest went quiet again, perfectly still, all at once, leaving me in the center of a circle I could not leave, watched by lenses that moved on their own, waiting for me to make the next mistake. I did not know whether to run or to stay. All I knew was that whatever had brought those cameras here, whatever had orchestrated their angles and their blinking, had chosen this moment to make me aware that I was the target, and that the slope, the untouched ground, and the lenses themselves were all pointing toward me.